The story begins in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the fall of 2003. The city was alive with the crisp air of autumn, trees painted in shades of orange and red, and the sound of high school football games echoing through small neighborhoods. Among the families who called this place home was the Carter family, a modest, hard-working household who believed in simple values, close bonds, and quiet routines. At the heart of their family was Sarah Carter, a 22-year-old college student whose life was filled with promise. Sarah was studying education at a local college, determined to become a teacher. She had spoken often about wanting to inspire children the way her own teachers had once inspired her. To her parents, Daniel and Margaret, she was not only their eldest daughter, but their pride, their hope for a brighter future. Sarah's personality radiated warmth. She was known for her calm nature and her kindness toward everyone she met. Friends describe her as someone who never turned away a person in need, even if it meant sacrificing her own time. She volunteered on weekends at a local library, where she helped children with reading programs. Books had always been her refuge, and literature was her passion. She believed stories could heal, teach, and connect people. Sarah also shared a special relationship with her younger brother, Jacob, who was 16 at the time. Despite the age gap, they were inseparable. He often joked that Sarah was more like a second mother than a sister. She tutored him in math, cheered at his soccer games, and listened to his teenage worries with patience. To Jacob, Sarah was not only family. She was his guide and his role model. The Carter home was a place of warmth and tradition. Sunday dinners were sacred, with Margaret's cooking filling the house and Daniel leading family conversations. Sarah always helped set the table, humming softly as she placed plates in order. Small moments like these defined the family's bond. They were ordinary, yet deeply meaningful, the kind of moments that would later haunt them when silence replaced laughter. Outside of family life, Sarah's days followed a busy rhythm. She worked part-time at a local cafe, a small shop near the college campus where regular customers adored her. The cafe was known for its friendly atmosphere, and Sarah added to that charm. She knew people by name, remembered their favorite drinks, and had a way of making strangers feel welcome. Co-workers describe her as reliable, hardworking, and always smiling, even during long shifts. Her circle of friends was close-knit. She had grown up with many of them in Grand Rapids, sharing childhood memories of bike rides, school dances, and summer trips to Lake Michigan. At 22, their bond remained strong. On weekends, they often gathered to watch movies or study together. Sarah's friends later recalled that she was the one who encouraged everyone, the one who believed in brighter days even during difficult times. Despite her busy schedule, Sarah carried herself with a quiet discipline. She was not one to seek attention or indulge in reckless behavior. She dreamed of graduating, securing a teaching job, and one day starting a family of her own. She often spoke about wanting to stay close to Grand Rapids, near her parents and brother, because she valued home above all else. In the fall of 2003, Sarah was just beginning to step into adulthood. She was balancing work, college, and dreams of the future with remarkable grace. She had no idea that her ordinary days, her routines, and her ambitions would soon become frozen in time, remembered not for how she lived, but for the tragedy that would follow. Her life represented the essence of small-town Michigan during that era, steady, grounded, and filled with community ties. Neighbors knew the Carters well. Daniel worked as a mechanic, Margaret volunteered at church, and Sarah was a daughter everyone admired. The Carters were respected, trusted, and cherished in their neighborhood. Sarah's compassion extended beyond her immediate circle. She cared deeply for children who struggled in school, especially those who came from broken homes. Her professors often praised her natural ability to connect with others. One of them once told Margaret that Sarah had a gift, the rare ability to make people feel safe, heard, and important. That was the teacher she wanted to become. On the night of her 22nd birthday, her family surprised her with a small celebration. Balloons decorated the living room. Jacob presented her with a handmade card, and her parents gave her a necklace with a delicate silver chain. Sarah hugged them all tightly, smiling as if life could only move forward with more joy. To her family, it was just another milestone, but in hindsight, it became one of the last pure memories they would ever have together. The people who knew Sarah best would later describe her as someone who embodied light in a world that could often feel dark. Her laughter filled rooms, her patience calmed tempers, and her faith in others inspired hope. She was not famous, she was not wealthy, but she was deeply loved. That love would become the reason her absence would tear through the community with such devastating force. By painting the picture of Sarah's world, her routines, her dreams, we see not just a victim, but a person full of life. And it is this very life, her laughter, her kindness, her potential, that makes the tragedy ahead impossible to ignore. Because soon, on a quiet October evening in 2003, Sarah Carter's path would be cut short. A single night would change everything, and the town of Grand Rapids would never be the same again. October 18, 2003. It was a Saturday evening in Grand Rapids, the kind of night that carried both the calm of autumn and the energy of small-town life. High school stadium lights glowed in the distance as local football games played out. The crisp air smelled of fallen leaves, and the streets were dotted with pumpkins set out for Halloween. For most families, it was an ordinary night, but for the Carter family, it would become a night etched in horror. That evening, Sarah Carter finished her shift at the cafe where she worked part-time. The small shop, a local favorite near campus, was busy earlier in the day with students and families. By closing time, it was quiet, the clatter of cups replaced by the low hum of the coffee machines. Sarah wiped down the counters, stacked chairs, and said goodbye to her coworker before walking out into the cool night air. It was 9:45 p.m. when she locked the door behind her. Sarah carried her purse, her college books, and a light jacket. Her car, a used blue sedan, was parked along a dimly lit street only a block away. She often drove home this way, a short 15-minute trip that led through winding suburban roads, past wooded stretches, and finally into the Carter neighborhood. It was a drive she had taken countless times before. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah came from a customer who saw her leaving the cafe. She appeared tired but cheerful, offering a polite wave before stepping into the night. After that, she vanished into the shadows of the city. When Sarah did not arrive home, her parents grew worried. At first, Margaret assumed her daughter had stayed late with a friend or stopped at the library, something she occasionally did. By 11 p.m., worry turned into unease. Daniel stepped onto the porch, scanning the dark street for headlights. Jacob tried calling Sarah's cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Minutes dragged into hours. The familiar comfort waiting for Sarah's car to pull into the driveway was replaced with silence that grew heavier with each passing moment. By midnight, the Carters knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah was responsible, punctual, and always let her family know if plans changed. Daniel grabbed his keys and drove the route from their house to the cafe, hoping to find her car along the way. The roads were quiet, the wind rattling through the trees, but there was no sign of Sarah. At 1:15 a.m., Daniel and Margaret called the police to report their daughter missing. The search began immediately. Officers drove the same route, checking parking lots, alleys, and gas stations. Neighbors were awakened by the sound of police radios and the sharp beam of flashlights cutting across lawns. The Carters waited in their living room, the clock ticking past 2 a.m., every sound from the street making them jump. And then a chilling discovery. Around 2:45 a.m., Sarah's car was found abandoned near a wooded stretch on the outskirts of town, less than 5 miles from the cafe. The vehicle was pulled slightly off the road, as if it had been hastily stopped. The driver's door was unlocked. Inside, officers found Sarah's purse, her textbooks, and her jacket neatly placed on the passenger seat. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. The sight of the car immediately sent dread through the officers and later, her family. If Sarah had left willingly, she would have taken her belongings. The unlocked door and untouched items painted a different picture, one that suggested she never made the decision to leave on her own. The wooded area where the car was found was quiet and unsettling. Branches swayed in the wind, and dry leaves scattered across the hood of the sedan. The only sound was the distant rush of traffic from a nearby highway. Officers searched the immediate area with flashlights, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. But the woods gave nothing back. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just silence. Back at the Carter home, The phone rang, shattering what little hope remained. When Daniel and Margaret heard that Sarah's car had been found abandoned, their worst fears deepened. Margaret collapsed into tears, while Jacob stared blankly, unable to believe his sister could simply vanish. The family rushed to the scene, where police held them back from the wooded road. Margaret pleaded with officers, her voice breaking, begging them to find her daughter. As the night turned into early morning, investigators treated the case as suspicious. Roadblocks were set up and K-9 units searched the surrounding woods, sniffing for a trail that might lead to Sarah. Volunteers from the community began gathering, flashlights in hand, unwilling to let the night pass without helping. The small stretch of road became a hive of activity. Flashing police lights, whispered speculation, and the quiet terror of knowing a young woman was missing. The media soon arrived, their cameras capturing the eerie image of the abandoned car under the glow of police floodlights. By dawn, Sarah's face would be on local news broadcasts, the headline simple and haunting: college student missing after leaving work. For the Carter family, every minute felt like an eternity. Margaret clutched the necklace she had given Sarah for her birthday, praying for her safe return. Daniel stood rigid, his jaw clenched, unwilling to break down in front of his family, but already drowning in guilt for not being able to protect his daughter. Jacob sat in silence, his mind replaying the last time he saw Sarah, wishing he had asked her to stay home that night. The peaceful October night had turned into a nightmare. What began as an ordinary Saturday ended with flashing lights, unanswered questions, and the chilling reality that Sarah Carter was gone. The abandoned car was the only clue, but it told a story that no one wanted to believe. A story of a young woman stepping into the night and never coming home. And as the sun rose over Grand Rapids on October 19th, the search for Sarah was no longer just a family's desperate hope. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the community for years to come. Because the question on everyone's mind was simple: who took Sarah Carter from the safety of her routine and why? The answer, as the investigation soon revealed, would be darker than anyone imagined. The disappearance of Sarah Carter sent shockwaves through Grand Rapids. By dawn on October 19th, 2003, her photograph, smiling bright-eyed, full of promise, appeared on every local news broadcast. Anchors repeated the same words: Sarah Carter, 21 years old, vanished last night after leaving work. Her car was found abandoned near the woods. For the Carter family, those words felt surreal, almost impossible to absorb. But for police, it meant one thing: time was already slipping away. The first 48 hours were critical. Every minute that passed without answers meant Sarah's chances of survival grew smaller. Detective Mark Reynolds was assigned as lead investigator. A seasoned officer in his 40s, Reynolds was known for his sharp instincts and relentless drive. Colleagues described him as calm under pressure, a man who carried a quiet intensity. When he arrived at the scene that morning, the air was still heavy with dew, the woods eerily silent. Reynolds studied the abandoned car, taking in every detail: the unlocked door, the person in the seat, the jacket untouched. To him, it screamed of an interrupted journey. Someone had stopped Sarah before she ever made it home. The investigation began with the people closest to Sarah. Detectives interviewed her co-workers at the cafe. Most described her as friendly and reliable, a young woman who never caused conflict. But one detail caught Reynolds' attention. A male co-worker gave conflicting accounts about when he last saw Sarah. At first, he said he left before his shift ended. Later, he admitted he lingered outside for a while after closing. His nervousness raised suspicion, but there was no solid evidence tying him to the disappearance. Another lead emerged in the form of a jealous ex-boyfriend. Sarah had broken off a relationship a year earlier, describing it as controlling and unhealthy. Friends recalled that he struggled to let go, occasionally showing up at her workplace uninvited. Detectives tracked him down and questioned him extensively. He denied any involvement, insisting he had not seen Sarah in months. His alibi placed him out of town that weekend, though Reynolds was not entirely convinced. The ex-boyfriend's lingering resentment cast a shadow over the case, but again, proof was lacking. As officers canvassed the area where Sarah's car was found, witnesses mentioned a local drifter seen wandering near the woods on the night she vanished. He was known in the community, a man in his 50s who often camped along the outskirts of town, doing odd jobs for food or spare change. Some claimed he had a temper. Others swore he was harmless. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He admitted being near the woods, but denied seeing Sarah or her car. His story wavered at points, yet no physical evidence connected him to crime. For Reynolds, the early days were a blur of leads, interviews, and mounting frustration. Every tip seemed to branch into suspicion, but none led to concrete answers. The Carter family was left in anguish, clinging to hope with each knock at the door, only to be crushed when detectives admitted they had no breakthroughs. Meanwhile, rumors spread quickly through the community. Some whispered that Sarah had run away, overwhelmed by school and work. Others pointed fingers at neighbors, claiming they had seen suspicious activity that night. Old grudges and small-town gossip mixed with fear, dividing the community. Everyone wanted answers, but the lack of progress bred impatience. At press conferences, Detective Reynolds stood before cameras, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. He urged the public to remain vigilant, to report anything unusual. "Someone knows something," he repeated. But as days turned into weeks, the once constant flow of tips began to slow. Behind the scenes, Reynolds felt the pressure intensify. The Carter family looked to him as their lifeline, the man who could bring their daughter home. Margaret's pleas echoed in his mind at night, while Daniel's silent, piercing stare weighed heavily on his shoulders. Reynolds pored over case files, retraced Sarah's last steps, and replayed every interview, searching for the missing piece. But the puzzle remained unsolved. Despite the chaos, one thing became clear. Sarah's disappearance was no accident. Something sinister had happened on that October night, whether it was a jealous ex, a lying coworker, or a drifter lurking in the woods. Someone had taken Sarah away, and the longer she remained missing, the harder it became to believe she would be found alive. The first weeks of the investigation ended with more questions than answers. The town of Grand Rapids was left on edge, fearful of a predator among them. For Detective Reynolds, it was the beginning of the hardest case of his career, one that would test not only his skills as an investigator, but also his endurance as a man determined to uncover the truth. In the quiet town of Grand Rapids, where neighbors greeted each other on porches and Sunday mornings were reserved for church, life shifted overnight. Sarah Carter's disappearance was not just a crime. It was a wound that cut into the very heart of the community. Her parents, Daniel and Margaret Carter, became the faces of that pain. Daniel, a man who had always been steady and strong, struggled to find words when reporters asked how he was holding up. His hands trembled as he clutched the microphone, his voice breaking as he said, "We just want our daughter back. Please, if you know anything, come forward." Margaret, standing beside him, could barely contain her tears. Her grief spilled into every word, her voice fragile, desperate. She pleaded not only for answers, but for mercy, for the safe return of the daughter she loved beyond measure. Sarah's younger brother, Jacob, just 16 years old, carried his own quiet devastation. Once a cheerful teenager who looked up to his sister, he now kept his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding cameras. To him, Sarah was not just a sibling. She was his confidant, his cheerleader, the one who helped with homework and teased him about his sneakers. With her gone, the world seemed colder, emptier. The community rallied quickly, pouring out support in every way they could. Vigils were held in churches, where hundreds of candles lit the pews in flickering warmth. At local schools, students tied ribbons to fences, each one bearing Sarah's name in bold ink. Teachers spoke softly of her kindness, her dreams of becoming a teacher herself. They remembered how she volunteered at the library, how she encouraged younger children to believe in themselves. The image of Sarah was no longer just her family's memory. It belonged to the entire town. Posters with her face appeared on every street corner, every lamppost, every shop window. Her smile, once a symbol of joy, now stared back at passers-by as a haunting reminder of what was lost. Volunteers walked the streets, taping flyers to telephone poles, handing them out at diners, gas stations, and parking lots. It became impossible to step outside without seeing her face. Fear also spread with that image. Grand Rapids was a place where doors were left unlocked, where children rode bikes after dark, and neighbors trusted one another. But now, people double-checked their locks, kept curtains drawn, and kept children indoors after sunset. Conversations in diners dropped to whispers when strangers entered. Suspicion lived in every glance. For the first time, the town felt unsafe. At the local diner, where Sarah often studied during late afternoons, the chatter changed from sports and weather to speculation and fear. Some were certain it was the ex-boyfriend. Others swore the drifter was guilty. Rumors multiplied with every retelling, weaving uncertainty into the fabric of the community. No one knew who to trust. The media amplified that tension. News crews arrived, their cameras flashing outside the Carter home. Every evening, footage of Margaret's tearful pleas filled living rooms across Michigan. Some viewers saw strength in her courage. Others turned away, unable to bear the rawness of a mother's heartbreak. Still, the family pressed on. They spoke at rallies. They gave interviews. They prayed aloud at vigils. Margaret clutched Sarah's favorite book, reading passages as if to remind the world of her daughter's love for literature, her dreams of one day guiding children in classrooms of her own. Daniel held Jacob close, their silhouettes outlined by candlelight at vigils that stretched late into the night. For many in Grand Rapids, the disappearance of Sarah Carter was more than a headline. It became a shared grief, a collective fear, and a relentless reminder that evil could touch even the most peaceful towns. But as weeks passed and no answers emerged, grief began to shift into something else. Beneath the prayers, beneath the unity, a darker feeling grew. The community wanted justice. They wanted someone to blame. And Detective Mark Reynolds knew that if he could not find answers soon, the fear threatening to unravel Grand Rapids would turn into anger, an anger that could destroy trust forever. The investigation into Sarah Carter's disappearance began with urgency and hope, but as the days stretched into weeks, every lead seemed to collapse under its own weight. Detectives first focused on the ex-boyfriend. His history with Sarah was troubling. The late-night arguments, the uninvited visits, the controlling behavior that had pushed her away. On paper, he looked like the perfect suspect. But when he was brought in for a polygraph, the results pointed to truthfulness. His alibi, though irritatingly solid, checked out. He had been in Detroit with relatives on the night Sarah vanished, confirmed by time-stamped receipts and multiple witnesses. The man who once loomed so large in Sarah's life slipped out of the investigation's grip, leaving only bitter frustration in his wake. The next focus was a coworker with conflicting stories. His nervous behavior during interviews had set off alarm bells, but deeper digging revealed an airtight alibi. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station placed him miles away at the time Sarah's car was abandoned. Reluctantly, Detective Mark Reynolds crossed his name off the suspect list. Another door slammed shut. Then there was the drifter. Seen by locals wandering near the woods, he had been a kind of figure easy to blame. A man without roots, without ties, without anyone to vouch for him. For a moment, it seemed promising. Detectives combed the area where he was last spotted, hoping to find a campsite, clothing, or even a trace of Sarah's belongings. But he had vanished like smoke. Days of searching led nowhere, and eventually the lead went cold. Some residents whispered that he had fled because he was guilty. Others believed he was simply another victim of circumstance, swallowed by the transient life he lived. Either way, the police had nothing to hold on to. As October gave way to November, the weight of failure pressed heavily on Reynolds and his team. Every day that ended without answers deepened the family's despair and stoked the community's anger. The Carters endured endless waiting, clinging to the phone for news that never came. Margaret's eyes grew hollow from sleepless nights. Daniel's once firm shoulders sagged under grief, and Jacob retreated further into silence. Detectives turned to technology and records, hoping for a break. They subpoenaed Sarah's phone records, combing through every call and text. Dozens of names were reviewed, yet nothing unusual appeared. The calls were to family, friends, coworkers. No mysterious numbers, no secret communications. Her life, as always, was simple, transparent, and heartbreakingly ordinary. Evidence from the car was equally discouraging. The forensic team carefully dusted for prints, swabbed for DNA, and bag fibers. Hope hung in the sterile air of the lab as detectives awaited results. But the fingerprints belonged only to Sarah and her family. The DNA traces collected from the steering wheel and door handles matched no one in national databases. In 2003, technology had not yet reached the precision it would years later. What little evidence they had was like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Frustration grew within the department. Officers argued over which lead to pursue, which tip to prioritize. Resources were stretched thin, and media pressure only intensified the tension. Every headline demanded answers. Every broadcast replayed the same questions. Where's Sarah Carter? Why have police found nothing? As weeks turned into a month, community faith in the investigation began to falter. At town meetings, voices rose in anger. Parents demanded more patrols. Shop owners criticized the lack of progress, and whispers began accusing the police of incompetence. Grand Rapids, once a town of unity, fractured under fear and suspicion. For Detective Reynolds, the case became an endless maze. Each lead began with hope, only to twist into another dead end. The ex-boyfriend, the co-worker, the drifter, names that had once burned brightly in the investigation, now faded into shadows of disappointment. And yet, Reynolds could not let them go entirely. In his mind, any one of them could still be guilty. He filed away every interview, every note, every small detail, convinced that someday one of those fragments would matter. But for now, the case was slipping. The silence around Sarah's disappearance grew heavier with each passing day, suffocating the town, suffocating her family, suffocating the very men sworn to find her. It was in those bleak weeks that the Carter family's pain deepened into something almost unbearable. Margaret's pleas to media grew more desperate, her voice raw from repeating the same words. Please, help us find Sarah. Daniel stood at her side, his face lined with sorrow and quiet rage, while Jacob remained in the background, his youthful innocence swallowed by grief. The tragedy of Sarah's disappearance was no longer just about finding her. It had become a test of endurance, for her family, for her community, and for the detectives chasing shadows. And as December crept closer, one painful truth hung in the air like frost. The investigation was running out of time. The first months after Sarah Carter's disappearance were filled with urgency, movement, and hope. But as winter faded into spring, the momentum slowed. Leads dried up, suspects were cleared, and the trail grew colder with every sunrise. By the time 2005 arrived, the investigation that once consumed Grand Rapids had been reduced to a stack of unsolved files in the records room. For the Carter family, time did not soften the blow. It sharpened it. Every day that passed without Sarah felt like a betrayal, as if the world had quietly agreed to move on while they remained frozen in October 2003. Her bedroom was left untouched, the books on her desk stacked as she had arranged them, her jacket still hanging by the door. Margaret Carter dusted the room weakly, whispering to herself as if her daughter might walk back in at any moment. Her father, Daniel, carried his grief differently. He returned to work at the factory, his shoulders bent under a weight no one else could see. He rarely spoke of Sarah in public, but at night, when the house grew quiet, he sat in the living room with the television muted, staring at the last photo taken of his daughter, a framed portrait of her in a soft blue sweater, smiling at the camera. Jacob, once the cheerful younger brother, matured quickly in the shadow of loss. By the time he graduated high school, his laughter had been replaced with silence. Friends described him as withdrawn, distant, a young man carrying a sorrow older than his years. He told no one, but in his wallet he carried a small photograph of him and Sarah from childhood. Two siblings on bicycles, their faces lit by summer sun. Detective Mark Reynolds fought the same silence in his own way. After nearly 2 years of chasing false leads, watching the case unravel in front of him, he made the painful decision to retire. Officially, he left because of health and age, but in truth, it was guilt. He carried Sarah's name with him, replaying every interview, every missed opportunity, every decision that had led nowhere. For Reynolds, leaving the badge behind did not bring peace. It only meant he now had to live with questions he could never answer. By 2005, the case was officially labeled cold. The announcement came quietly, almost like a whisper. It was a single sentence delivered at a press conference. At this time, the Carter investigation will remain open but inactive, pending new evidence. To the Carter family, those words cut deeper than any knife. They meant the system had moved on. Sarah's story would no longer command daily attention, no longer demand resources, no longer weigh on a department schedule. Yet, in Grand Rapids, her name was never far from memory. At church services, prayers for the Carter girl were spoken aloud. At local diners, whispers resurfaced whenever the anniversary passed. "Do you remember Sarah?" became a phrase spoken with lowered voices, a reminder of a darkness that still lingered in the town's past. On Sarah's birthdays, the Carter family lit candles in the living room, gathering in silence before Margaret read aloud from one of her daughter's favorite books. The ritual became their way of holding on, their fragile thread to a girl whose absence filled every corner of their lives. But grief has a way of isolating. Over time, the support that once poured in from neighbors grew quieter. Posters were taken down, vigils no longer held. The town that had once been united in fear slowly returned to its routines. For many, Sarah's disappearance became an echo, remembered only when the leaves began to fall or the woods were passed on a quiet drive. For her family, however, the silence was deafening. Each day without answers felt like another layer of distance between them and Sarah. Margaret once described it best in an interview years later. "It is like waiting in a room where no one ever enters. You wait, and the door never opens." The Carter case became another file in the growing archive of unsolved crimes. Another name, another photograph, another family left behind. But while the town moved forward and the department closed its books, one truth remained. Sarah's story was not over. Her absence continued to haunt Grand Rapids, an unfinished chapter waiting to be told. And though the years piled on like dust over forgotten files, the shadows of October 2003 had not yet given up all their secrets. For nearly 2 decades, Sarah Carter's name sat in silence inside a gray file box marked unsolved. The papers had yellowed with time, photographs dulled with age, and memories of that autumn night in 2003 had become whispers in Grand Rapids. The case, like so many others, was thought to be frozen in the past. But in 2021, everything changed. The Michigan Cold Case Unit had recently secured funding to revisit long-forgotten investigations. Among the boxes stacked on metal shelves in their Lansing office, one file caught the attention of Detective Sarah Mitchell. She was 39 years old, sharp, and known for her persistence. Unlike many of her peers, she had grown up in an era where forensic technology advanced rapidly, and she believed science could succeed where old methods had failed. When she opened Sarah Carter's file, Mitchell felt the weight of history pressing against her. Inside were handwritten notes from Detective Reynolds, black and white photographs of the wooded area, and a sealed evidence bag containing fibers and swabs collected from Sarah's clothing. For years, this evidence had been tested against limited databases, always returning nothing. But in 2021, technology had advanced in ways investigators of 2003 could never have imagined. Mitchell sent the clothing samples to the state crime lab for next-generation DNA testing. Unlike the older techniques, this process could build profiles from even the faintest traces, partial skin cells, degraded fragments invisible to the naked eye. The wait for results stretched into weeks. And though Mitchell had worked dozens of cold cases before, something about Sarah's file lingered with her. She read Reynolds' notes late into the night, sensing the quiet obsession that had consumed him until his retirement. It was as though she had inherited his unfinished battle. Then, in early March 2021, the call came. The lab technician's voice carried an edge of excitement. A partial DNA match had been recovered from the fibers of Sarah's sweater. The evidence, dormant for 18 years, finally spoke. It matched a man recently entered into the system, Richard Lawson, age 45, who had been arrested just months earlier for a separate assault in Michigan. Mitchell froze as she processed the words. For nearly 2 decades, the Carter family had waited in darkness, and now, science had delivered a spark. The breakthrough was small, only a partial match, but was enough to pull Lawson into the light of suspicion. The discovery jolted the investigation back to life. Mitchell called in her team and spread the photographs across a long table. Lawson's mugshot stared back, a man with sunken eyes, graying hair, and a hard expression. He had a record of petty crimes, bar fights, and minor thefts, but nothing in his past hinted at abduction or murder. Yet his DNA told a different story. Mitchell dug deeper. Lawson had lived in Grand Rapids in 2003. Records showed he worked at a construction site, just 3 miles from where Sarah's car was abandoned. Old employment files revealed disciplinary write-ups for aggression. Former co-workers described him as volatile, prone to sudden bursts of anger. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and meaningless, began to take shape. When Mitchell informed the Carter family, the news struck like thunder. Margaret wept, her hands trembling as she whispered, "After all these years," Daniel's face tightened, anger and relief colliding in his eyes. Jacob, now a grown man, struggled to comprehend that the shadow over his life might finally be named. For the community of Grand Rapids, the revelation was equally shocking. People who had long since stopped speaking of the Carter girl were forced to remember. The idea that Sarah's killer had lived among them all those years was chilling. Neighbors recalled a quiet man who kept to himself. Others remembered run-ins marked by hostility. And still others admitted they barely noticed him at all. The power of technology had breathed life into a case thought buried. Where human memory failed, science prevailed. The evidence that had once whispered faintly now shouted with clarity. Detective Mitchell pressed forward with determination. Lawson's past was scrutinized, his movements in 2003 mapped against Sarah's disappearance. The evidence was still building. But the DNA had unlocked a door that had remained sealed for 18 years. Behind it lay the truth that Reynolds had chased until his final days, and that the Carter family had prayed for every sleepless night. The breakthrough marked a turning point. For nearly 2 decades, the story of Sarah Carter had been one of loss and silence. Now, with the cold gleam of science, it became a story of pursuit and justice. But with the suspect's name on the table, the investigation was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The truth was closer than ever, and so was the darkness that had taken Sarah's life. Detective Sarah Mitchell had worked dozens of cases in her career, but none gripped her the way Sarah Carter's did. The partial DNA match to Richard Lawson was not just evidence. It was a challenge, a spark that lit a fire inside her. From the moment she saw Lawson's name on the lab report, Sarah's face became a constant presence in her thoughts. Every morning, Mitchell started her day with the file open on her desk, and every night she carried its weight home like an unfinished chapter that refused to let her rest. She immersed herself in Sarah's final hours. Retracing steps that had gone cold almost 2 decades earlier, Mitchell drove the same road Sarah had traveled the night she vanished. She parked near the lot where Sarah's car was found abandoned, sitting quietly as the woods stretched around her, still holding their secrets. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind through the trees. Mitchell tried to imagine what Sarah might have seen, what she might have felt, in those last moments. Her obsession took her back to the witness statements recorded in 2003. Dozens of interviews, many of them rushed, all of them incomplete. Mitchell noticed contradictions others had overlooked. One resident claimed they saw nothing unusual that night, but in a later statement, mentioned headlights near the wooded lot. Another recalled a man walking along the roadside, his face hidden beneath a hood, but the detail had been dismissed as unreliable. To Mitchell, these fragments were not meaningless. They were pieces of a larger truth. Determined to shake the dust off the past, she began re-interviewing witnesses. Some were reluctant, their memories hazy, but Mitchell's persistence broke through. One elderly woman, now in her 70s, hesitated before finally sharing what she had seen from reports the night Sarah disappeared. A dark pickup truck, parked near the lot where the car was later discovered. The woman had assumed it belonged to hunters or travelers, but she remembered the driver lingering, headlights off, as though waiting. The detail had never been logged in the original report. Whether it was overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant, no one knew. But to Mitchell, it was a breakthrough. Richard Lawson had driven a similar truck in 2003, a fact confirmed by old vehicle registrations she pulled from state records. The connection was far from proof, but it was enough to tighten the circle. Mitchell also returned to the wooded area itself, refusing to see it only through the faded photographs. Nearly 20 years had passed, yet the terrain remained hauntingly familiar. The uneven ground, the thicket of trees, the silence pressing down like a blanket. She walked every path, flashlight in hand, even during the day, searching for anything missed. There were no new physical discoveries, but her instinct told her the scene still had stories left to tell. Her determination breathed life into the stagnant case, where Detective Reynolds had grown weary and broken by years of failure. Mitchell carried unshakable resolve. She was not willing to let Sarah become another statistic. The Carter family, though scarred by decades of grief, found new hope in her energy. Margaret Carter clutched Mitchell's hands during a meeting and whispered, "Do not stop. Please do not stop." For Mitchell, those words sealed her purpose. She knew the odds, knew how cold cases could unravel just as quickly as they seemed to solidify. But she pressed forward. Each overlooked detail she uncovered, each inconsistency she exposed, brought her closer to the truth. The investigation no longer felt like simply a job. It was personal, almost spiritual, as though she were carrying the torch for Sarah, for Reynolds, and for every family who had ever waited in silence for answers. The audience would see her obsession not as recklessness, but as justice reignited in her hands. The despair that had once defined the case began to transform into momentum. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the story of Sarah Carter no longer felt trapped in the shadows. And as Mitchell pinned Lawson's photo beside a sketch of the dark truck on her investigation board, she knew the chase was only beginning. For nearly 2 decades, Sarah Carter's disappearance had haunted Grand Rapids. The cold case files gathered dust, the family's hope dimmed, and the town tried to move on. But in 2021, the DNA breakthrough pointed investigators in one shocking direction: Thomas Blake. Blake was no stranger to the town. In 2003, he had worked as a local mechanic, fixing cars in a cluttered garage off the main road. To many, he was quiet and hard-working, keeping to himself. But beneath that exterior, he carried a reputation. Neighbors whispered about his temper, sudden outbursts, and an unsettling volatility that often left people uneasy. Police records showed several past incidents: bar fights, arguments with co-workers, and restraining orders filed by an ex-girlfriend. Nothing had ever stuck long enough to land him in prison. But the pattern was clear. Thomas Blake was a man with a dark side. Detective Sarah Mitchell could not ignore the connection. The partial DNA profile found on Sarah's clothing was now a full match to Blake, thanks to advances in technology. Armed with the evidence, Mitchell and her team prepared to confront the man who had slipped through the cracks for so long. The arrest came quietly. Officers surrounded Blake outside his small home on the outskirts of town. He looked older now, his hair graying, his once broad shoulders hunched from years of labor. At first, he appeared calm, insisting he had nothing to hide. But Mitchell knew the truth was waiting beneath the surface. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Blake sat across from Mitchell, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes darting toward the mirrored wall as if searching for escape. The detective began with questions about 2003, where he worked, who he knew, what he remembered about Sarah Carter. Blake's answers were short, deflective, almost rehearsed. Then Mitchell slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of Sarah, images of the wooded area, and finally, the DNA report. "Thomas," she said evenly, "we found your DNA on Sarah's clothing. You were there." For a moment, silence filled the room. Blake's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, then shifted downward. He muttered a denial, weak and unconvincing. Mitchell pressed harder, her voice steady but firm. She reminded him that the science did not lie, that the truth had waited long enough. Hours passed. Blake shifted from denial to anger, then to silence. But as the weight of evidence closed in, cracks began to show. His breathing grew uneven, his hands trembled, and finally, with his head in his hands, he whispered words that shattered the room. "I never meant for it to go that far." The confession spilled out in fragments at first, then in chilling detail. Blake admitted he had seen Sarah leaving her cafe job on the night of October 18th, 2003. He had offered her a ride, but she politely declined. That rejection, he said, triggered something inside him. Fueled by anger and a need for control, he forced her into his truck. His voice shook as he described the struggle, Sarah's fear, and the desperate pleas she made as he drove toward a wooded area outside town. Investigators listened in horror as Blake recounted the final hours of Sarah's life. He spoke of his rage, his inability to stop once he had crossed the line. He described how the night ended in violence, how he left her in the woods, alone in the cold October darkness. Every word carried the weight of 20 years of silence. Every detail a blade to the hearts of those who had waited for answers. Mitchell kept her composure, though inside, the storm of anger and sorrow raged. The confession was a breakthrough the case had needed, but hearing Sarah's last moments laid bare was almost unbearable. When Blake finished, there was no relief in his voice, only exhaustion, as if the truth had finally stripped away the last shield he had carried. Word of the confession spread quickly through the department, and soon the community knew. After years of whispers, dead ends, and fading hope, the town was stunned. The face that had once been just another neighbor was now revealed as the man responsible for stealing Sarah's life. For the Carter family, the news was devastating. The truth confirmed their worst fears, yet it ended the agonizing uncertainty that had haunted them for so long. Margaret Carter wept as she heard the details, clutching Jacob's hand. Daniel Carter stared in silence, his grief heavy but his resolve clear. They finally knew who had taken their daughter. In Grand Rapids, the story reignited painful memories. People remembered the posters on street corners, the vigils, the nights of fear when children were kept indoors. The revelation that it had been Thomas Blake, a mechanic who lived among them, left the community shaken to its core. For Detective Sarah Mitchell, the confession marked both a triumph and a tragedy. She had delivered the answers long overdue, but those answers carried unbearable weight. As she filed the report, her hands lingered on the photo of Sarah Carter, her eyes filled with a quiet promise. Justice was finally within reach. But one question lingered in the air, haunting everyone who heard Blake's words. It had hidden the truth for nearly 2 decades. What other secrets might still lie in the shadows? The day Thomas Blake was arrested, Grand Rapids felt like it had woken from a nightmare that had lasted nearly 20 years. Police cars lined his quiet street, their flashing lights cutting through the autumn morning. Neighbors stood on sidewalks in stunned silence, watching as officers led Blake away in handcuffs. For years, he had lived among them, fixing their cars, making small talk at the gas station, waving politely at children on bicycles. Now, that familiar face was revealed as the man responsible for Sarah Carter's disappearance. Shock spread quickly. Families who had trusted him felt betrayed. Old friends who once shared drinks with him at local bars admitted they never truly knew who he was. Whispers filled grocery aisles and church pews. The unthinkable truth had shattered the illusion of safety in their small community. For the Carter family, the arrest was a moment of conflicted emotions. Daniel Carter said little, but his silence carried a heavy weight. Margaret wept openly, torn between relief and the crushing sorrow of confirmation. They had prayed for answers, yet hearing them left wounds that could never heal. Jacob, now older and hardened by years of grief, spoke for the family. We wanted justice, but nothing will bring my sister back. Their pain was etched into every word, every glance, every tear shed outside the courthouse. The trial that followed became more than a legal proceeding. It was a stage for raw emotion, a place where the entire town confronted the man who had stolen their daughter, their friend, their neighbor. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Reporters filled the benches, cameras waiting outside to capture every development. This was no longer just a local story. It had become one of Michigan's most shocking cold case breakthroughs. Blake sat at the defense table, older, weary, and expressionless. The once volcanic temper that had defined him seemed extinguished, replaced by resignation. Yet his lack of remorse only fueled the community's outrage. Each piece of evidence presented, the DNA, the confession, the timeline, tightened the case around him like a vice. Detectives testified about years of frustration, about the moment the DNA match broke the silence of the cold case. But the most emotional moments came when Sarah's family took the stand. Margaret's voice trembled as she described her daughter's laughter, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the endless nights of wondering if she was still alive. Daniel, usually quiet, spoke firmly about the hollow birthdays, the empty seat at Christmas, the ache that had never left their home. Jacob's testimony cut deepest of all, as he spoke about growing up without his sister, about how her absence shaped every milestone of his life. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for only a short time. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a ripple of emotion swept the room. Margaret clutched Daniel's hand. Jacob bowed his head. Justice had finally come, though it arrived 2 decades late. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to capture the family's reaction. Margaret, her voice steady despite her tears, told the cameras, "We are grateful for justice, but we will never stop missing Sarah. She should still be here." Her words echoed across news broadcasts, capturing the bittersweet heart of the moment. For the town of Grand Rapids, the case became a reminder of resilience and the long reach of justice. The community gathered again, this time not in fear, but in remembrance. Candles were lit at the same church where vigils once begged for Sarah's safe return. Now, they burn in honor of her life, and in recognition that truth, though delayed, had finally prevailed. As Thomas Blake was led away to begin his life sentence, the people of Grand Rapids exhaled together. Justice had been served. But beneath the relief, a deeper truth lingered. The shadow of Sarah Carter's loss would remain forever. Nearly 20 years had passed between the night Sarah Carter vanished and the day justice was finally delivered. 2 decades of unanswered questions, of birthdays missed, of holidays spent with an empty chair at the family table. For her parents and her brother, the journey had been an unending storm of grief, hope, and despair. Now, at last, they stood with answers that both healed and hurt. The pain of waiting that long is something only families of the missing truly understand. It is a wound that never closes, reopening with every headline, every rumor, every phone call that leads nowhere. Daniel and Margaret Carter endured that torment, clinging to one another when the world grew too heavy. Jacob grew from a boy into a man in the shadow of loss, his childhood marked not by freedom, but by fear and longing. Together, they became a picture of resilience, proof that love can endure even in the absence of hope. Detectives carried their own scars. Mark Reynolds, who first led the case in 2003, retired with guilt heavy on his shoulders, believing he had failed Sarah. Years later, Detective Sarah Mitchell stepped in, driven by the same desire that once fueled Reynolds. Her determination, coupled with advancements in forensic science, finally broke the silence. She gave the Carter family what they had been denied for so long, the truth. The case stood as a testament to persistence, to the refusal to let Sarah's memory fade into another statistic. Modern forensic science played the role of silent witness. What human eyes missed, technology captured. The DNA that lay dormant for years became the key to unlocking a mystery once thought unsolvable. It was proof that cold cases may age, but they do not disappear. Evidence waits, quietly, until the right tools are ready to reveal its story. In Sarah's case, science became the voice she could no longer use to speak for herself. The final act of closure came quietly, far from the cameras and courtrooms. The Carter family gathered at Sarah's grave, the same place where for years they had come only with unanswered prayers. This time, they came with flowers. Margaret laid a bouquet of lilies, Sarah's favorite, across the headstone. Daniel whispered a promise to his daughter, a vow that she would never be forgotten. Jacob placed his hand on the stone, a silent gesture of love that spoke louder than words. For the first time, they left not with questions, but with a measure of peace. The town of Grand Rapids carried its own lessons. The people who once feared the shadows after Sarah's disappearance now understood the importance of vigilance, of supporting families in their darkest hours, and of trusting in the slow, relentless march of justice. The case that once divided them now united them in remembrance. As this story closes, one truth lingers. Cold cases may sleep, but truth has a way of returning. No matter how many years pass, no matter how many dead ends, the possibility of justice remains. For the Carter family, justice came late. Too late to save Sarah's life, but not too late to honor it. Sarah Carter's name will forever be etched into memory of her town, not as just another victim, but as a daughter, a sister, a friend whose life was cut short but not erased. Through her story, we are reminded of the strength of families, the dedication of investigators, and the quiet power of science that speaks for those who no longer can. The candles once lit in desperation now burn in remembrance. The prayers once whispered in fear are now offered in peace. And though the loss of Sarah Carter will never fade, her story leaves behind a legacy, the unshakable belief that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way home.